Well, people, I would have much to say about Paul Whelton, and that I'm going to introduce before he is going to give the first talk, and after the lunch break, the second speech in our international meeting. It's really an international meeting. In 1996, Sandra arranged to go to Hopkins to do his postdoctoral training abroad. And as a husband, I had to say, are you coming with me? Yes, my wife. With a great pleasure. Then I looked at my papers at that time. The young guys here don't know that the papers were at this format. They were not PDF files. They are really papers in the shelves. And I found someone from Hopkins that I have learned before that was working there with a very nice paper about the international burden of hypertension, published in the Lancet, I think in 1994, around that. And I sent a letter, the old way of asking people about things to Paul Whelton, and he responded me to say, please come, I'm going to find a place to you, okay? And then in 1996, 1997, I and Sandra and our kids, we spent a very nice time in Baltimore at the Johns Hopkins University, but not only in Johns Hopkins University, at the Welch Center, the Center for Primary Care, for Prevention, Research in this area, that was founded by Paul Whelton. Inside Hopkins, a very spectacular facilities, and they gave me a room and everything that some of my close friends know had a great impact in my studies and the things that I did after that. But much could be said about what Paul was born in Ireland, got his medical degree in Ireland, thereafter a master in science in London, and a medical residency in internal medicine, after in nephrology at Johns Hopkins, and spent, I think, 26 years at Hopkins, about that. And thereafter he went, when I was there, he left. He went to Tulane to be the dean of the School of Public Health, and the history is quite long. I could say about that she has 289 papers in PubMed, 20,615 citations, and 73, the age index, the citation index of Paul is 73, the sum of everybody, our hospital altogether. This is the scientific career. But to talk about the man, I have two documents. I'm going to read just two paragraphs. The first one is a profile about Paul that's published in The Lancet by Annie Harding in 2006, after the Katrina catastrophe. And the first paragraph, Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans at a Monday. The leaves broke and flooded the city on Tuesday. And by Friday, Paul Whelton had helped engineer the evacuation of the Tulane University Health Science Center's faculty, staff, and patients. More than 1,500 people in all. And Paul said, we didn't lose a single patient or staff or faculty or anybody, which was just amazing. Says Whelton, a professor of epidemiology and medicine at the Tulane University School of Medicine, at that time the senior vice president for health science. Then it accumulates several positions in the same university. And I had the pleasure 10 months later to receive a letter from Paul that he shared with me here in Brazil, that he had sent to their staff, to their colleagues in the university, describing everything that was done in the, you cannot figure out what happened. As the clinical hospital was underwater, the refrigerators, the freezers, everything. They lost the genetic material from the Bogalusa study. They could not save that material, but could save the rats, genetic changed rats that were put in the boats, and the university kept working in this scenario. And the last paragraph that I'm going to read is from this letter from Paul. Overall progress to date, this paragraph has much to do with what we're doing here in our hospital. Working together, working as a team, looking for the best that we can do, the excellence, and so on. Because he said, progress to date has far exceeded my expectations. I do not mean to diminish the enormity of challenges that we have faced over the last 10 months, or to suggest that we are back to normal. However, we have made monumental progress and laid the foundation for an even stronger health science care of Tulane in the future. I'm very grateful to all who have participated in the recovery effort and will remain committed to the resurgence of Health Science Center. We do not need to rebuild our institution. We are just building it, okay? And this meeting, this international meeting is a part of that. And I'm going to see that by Paul, that's presently the chair of ALLHAT. This is your position today. Huh? The ALLHAT is still running with data, publications, and so on. The database, wonderful database. And this is the first talk that Paul is going to give. Please, Paul.
It's you're far too generous. I was afraid you were going to tell the truth, so I'm glad you hid that. But it's a wonderful pleasure to be back in Porto Alegre among so many friends, and Sandra, Carisi, and others. Thank you for inviting me. It's a special privilege, of course, to be here at a symposium that's honoring Professor Ribeiro. The first talk I'm going to give this afternoon is about ALLHAT, because I think it's, to me, a very important trial that has had impact, and a bit like Mr. Fit, the trial itself I would like to believe was important, but perhaps the bigger legacy will be from some other things that we're doing with ALLHAT. I have no disclosures or conflict of interest. So obviously there are a lot of questions in the field of hypertension, and these are just some of the ones that I think are the more important. I'm not going to deal with the other ones in any great length. I'll talk a little about sodium later on, because I think it's a really important public health, an achievable public health intervention. We know this one. ALLHAT will address this, and I won't address this, but I'm also chairing another trial called SPRINT, and we've recruited a little under 10,000 participants, and we're looking for how low to go, and it's one of those intensive reduction trials. I think there's some interesting signals that have come from ACCORD, and now SPS3 has just been presented. It hasn't been published. So I think what we're at least seeing in those trials is no harm to those in the very low levels of blood pressure, and a very strong signal coming, I think, around stroke. So we'll wait to see what SPRINT shows, and I know there's another trial that's just starting up in Latin America. I know in Argentina. I don't know if Brazil is involved in it, but those are important questions. ALLHAT was really designed to try to address this question, and it had been around it for a very, very long time. Like others, I had gone to the National Institutes of Health on numerous occasions, and I sat on council to make the case for doing a trial that would fairly compare first-step therapies head-to-head to see if there's a difference, because there was intense marketing going on, as I know there was in Brazil as well. And it was a very difficult sell, because so many of my colleagues would say, well, that's going to cost an enormous amount of money, and why wouldn't industry do that? We shouldn't have to pay for that out of taxpayers' money. But it was pretty obvious that industry was reluctant or unlikely to do a fair head-to-head comparison. And of course, at that time, we knew that with a huge body of data on diuretics versus placebo, and when you looked at that body of data, I always said, when you looked at that and you saw how impressive the reductions in risk were for stroke and coronary heart disease, that it was going in a fair test to be very difficult to do better than the diuretics were doing. But we knew at that time that ACEs versus placebo reduced the risk of both stroke and coronary heart disease, and likewise for calcium channel blockers. There were quite a number of people who felt that diuretics were dangerous in the long term, in large part because of their effects on biochemical parameters. There were many who felt that ACEs were somehow magical, that by interfering with the renin-angiotensin system, there was something very special going on. And they had a very strong belief. And then there were those who believed in calcium channel blockers, and as those of you who've been around a while will know, there were many who felt calcium channel blockers were exceedingly dangerous, and there were several editorials written saying calcium channel blockers should be taken off the market because they were causing coronary heart disease. So there was a great deal of uncertainty, a lot of trials that were poorly designed, poorly conducted, overly interpreted were published, promoting A versus B versus C. So we did the ALLHAT study. We got permission to do it. We did a Vanguard originally, and then went into a main trial, and started in the late 90s and took the trial through 2002, with each participant having about 5 years of follow-up. One of the nice things about ALLHAT was that it had many centers with diverse practice settings. So unlike many of the other trials, we did have academic centers, but we had a lot of HMOs, we had a lot of private practice settings, and the settings, the clinics, were very much distributed according to the population of the United States. There were a few centers in Canada, and we had some centers in Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. The primary sponsor was National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, with concurrent strong support from the VA. There was assistance from the pharmaceutical companies, particularly Pfizer, but the money was sent to the NIH, and it was firewalled, so they had no participation in the design of the study, the conduct of the study, the analysis of the study. So in that sense, the NIH is very good about being able to firewall off commercial sponsors. I think one of the nice things about ALLHAT, of course, with any trial, obviously what you have to have is internal validity. If you don't have that, there's nothing to talk about from the trial itself. But we usually don't have very good external validity or generalizability. And ALLHAT perhaps is one of those sort of big, large, quote-unquote, simple trials that has much more generalizability than the majority of trials that are published. But obviously, when you're thinking about the design of any trial, including ALLHAT, you're wanting to design it such that you can be pretty sure that the only difference is the difference between the new therapy that you want to test and the control. And that you have all the usual parameters of high adherence, high quality, you get the outcomes, they're fairly assessed, and you do the analysis properly. Essentially, the way ALLHAT was set up was to get enough events that we would be able to ask a very specific question. Many cardiovascular trials use composite outcomes. There are pros and cons. Obviously, the advantage is you get more statistical power. The disadvantage is that we see a lot of trials with composite outcomes where the assumption is that it's all part of the same causal pathway, but that's not always very convincing. And in this case, the real discussion points around these different agents centered around coronary heart disease. There was little doubt in anybody's mind that they were all very beneficial with respect to stroke and the very blood pressure sensitive outcomes. The real question was there a difference when you use these drugs to try to prevent coronary heart disease? So we ended up having 4 different arms, so obviously that required a pretty big sample size because I'll show you for the blood pressure trial, our primary outcome was coronary heart disease. So we went for people with hypertension. They had to be above 55, have at least one additional risk factor, and that got us enough risk with enough people to get the right power. We not only did a blood pressure trial, but a lipid trial. The lipid trial compared pravastatin with usual care. It was an open trial or open label trial, so we really only looked here at something that couldn't be influenced by observer bias, all-cause mortality. I won't dwell on it today. It showed the pattern that you might expect, a beneficial trend, very consistent with the other trials, but I think there are better trials to answer this question more directly, and we always knew there would be. So I'm going to focus on the blood pressure component of ALLHAT. And here we picked the 4 arms, and just to say why did we pick these particular drugs, we picked chlorthalidone because although thiazides had been used in other trials, and I started my career with the Medical Research Council in their main trial and the trial in the elderly which used a thiazide, it had been proven to be effective. The larger burden of proof really was with chlorthalidone, and there was a feeling then, and I think there's an even stronger feeling now, that chlorthalidone was a better drug. It just had a better half-life profile. So we chose chlorthalidone. We chose amlodipine because it was the most widely used calcium channel blocker, and it seemed a good one. We chose lisinopril pretty much for the same reason. It was the most commonly used ACE inhibitor in the US at that time. We did include an alpha receptor blocker arm because it was an interesting, it hadn't been demonstrated to reduce either stroke or coronary heart disease mortality against a placebo, but it had a very interesting profile for its effect on risk factors, so we thought we would include that. In fact, our external monitoring board picked up signals, not so much of risk with doxazosin, but huge differences between chlorthalidone and doxazosin quite early. So within 18 months, they recommended to the NIH that that comparison be abandoned. There was a difference not only for several types of cardiovascular outcome, but a very striking difference in heart failure mortality and overall heart failure. So we continued with these 3 through the expected duration of follow-up, on average 5 years for each participant. And you see the primary endpoint was set for coronary heart disease, fatal coronary heart disease and non-fatal MI. We also obviously looked at a lot of other endpoints. We looked at all-cause mortality, stroke, various combinations of expanded definitions of coronary heart disease with somewhat, if you will, weak endpoints that might overwhelm the more serious endpoints and might be subject to some bias, and expanded definitions of cardiovascular disease as a whole. We also had lots of interest in renal disease, cancer, and many other outcomes as well. Well, when you're trying to set it up so that the only difference is the drug difference that you're interested in, it's quite challenging to do that. And of course, in getting the science of the trial exact, the problem is that you move well away from the norms of clinical practice, where we have complicated algorithms for how we decide what to treat somebody with. Whereas here, we have to really set up the design such that it answers the specific question we have in mind. And the specific question here was set up as a superiority trial. Were either of these new agents, endoxazosin when it was being tested, better than chlorthalidone? Because we already knew chlorthalidone was good. So we set it up as double-blind because for obvious reasons there might be a lot of bias and ascertainment if we didn't do that. We went through a dosing schedule that allowed us to get to full doses while maintaining the blind, and then we supplied step 2 and step 3 agents. And in fact, we ended up with arms that were almost identical with the exception of the study drugs of interest. We had good adherence throughout the trial for each of the 3 agents, a little better for chlorthalidone, but all of them were very acceptable, and we had very modest crossover. We worked hard to avoid that. Here are the baseline characteristics. They're pretty similar for the 3 groups, as one might expect from such a large sample size. But we worked hard to include groups that were important to us for generalizability. So obviously blacks are an important part of the population in the US, and they suffer disproportionately from the burden of high blood pressure and cardiovascular disease. We wanted to have a good representation of women, and we got that. And we also wanted to have a good representation of diabetics, and we got that because we were interested in looking at some subgroups, including age, gender, sex, and diabetes. Here's the blood pressure distribution throughout the trial. Of course, you'd like to have the blood pressures identical, and they're not quite identical, but they're pretty close. So, modest differences with chlorthalidone doing a little better than the other 2 agents, particularly compared to lisinopril for systolic, and about a 1 millimeter difference in diastolic blood pressure between lisinopril and amlodipine being the lowest. When we got to look at the results, they were impressive. There wasn't any suggestion that either amlodipine or lisinopril was better than chlorthalidone for the coronary heart disease endpoint. There wasn't any difference they were any worse either. And likewise for all-cause mortality. There was a difference for stroke between lisinopril and chlorthalidone. It achieved statistical significance, and I'll talk some more about that in a moment. But the real impressive difference was heart failure, and it was very impressive for the thiazide versus the calcium channel blocker representative, but it was also quite impressive for thiazide versus lisinopril, and I'll speak to that a little more as well. When we looked across our major subgroups, we saw one interaction, and we tested for a lot of interactions, but the only interaction that we saw was an interaction by race for the stroke outcome. And it appeared that overall, of course, the benefit for thiazide was, for chlorthalidone was there, but it seemed that this was particularly the case in African Americans, and they did indeed have a better blood pressure response to the diuretic versus the ACE inhibitor. When we looked at heart failure, the benefit or the difference was very consistent both for chlorthalidone versus amlodipine and chlorthalidone versus lisinopril. We saw it across all the major subgroups. And then we looked very carefully at heart failure, because always people find fault with a trial. It doesn't really matter what you find, somebody's not going to be happy. So we had a lot of unhappy people, and the claim was made very early that, well, this heart failure is nothing. It's really pedal edema, and they gave them diuretics, and that's the difference. And that was ridiculous from the outset, because our primary heart failure indicator was hospitalized and fatal heart failure, which is a fairly solid endpoint. If you ever look at the risk that has for subsequent mortality, it's extraordinarily high. But we went and we did a lot of other stuff. We looked at hospital heart failure on its own. We looked at this was our primary endpoint for our primary classification for heart failure. We looked at first documented, and then we looked at lots of different definitions of heart failure, including several from the Framium and then just the reviewer's opinion. Now, what you find when you go through this exercise will not surprise you. A lot of these, when you use different definitions, in the end, they're all pretty interrelated, because even when reviewers are looking at, they're looking for some fundamentals that are included in all of these approaches. But it doesn't really matter what endpoint we took, whether it was just fatal, hospital, or what definitions we used. We saw the same patterns. It was consistent, and it did not look like this was occurring by chance alone. So that in itself, I think, influenced a lot the Joint National Committee recommendations, which I personally agree with, starting with lifestyles, and then there were no compelling indications, either starting with a thiazide type agent on its own or one in combination with one of the other major entities. In our country, the Joint National Committee 8th report is under review right now. It'll come out very soon. I'm not on the committee, thank God, this time. And my hunch is that this isn't going to change very much, because I don't think any new data has come out that's compelling to change it. Well, one of the concerns, of course, that comes to light always is the biochemical changes that occur with thiazides, as opposed to amlodipine, which one might say is biochemically neutral. We always see some modest change in cholesterol, probably due to hemoconcentration. And it's common to see change in potassium, and that probably drives what we see as a change in blood sugar. When we looked at blood sugar and biochemical diabetes, we saw that change in all three of the treatment groups. It was a little greater in the chlorthalidone group, if you assume, which I think is reasonable, that amlodipine is biochemically neutral, then about 15% of the change that we saw with the diuretic was probably specific to the diuretic itself. And obviously the question is, what are the implications of diuretic-related hyperglycemia? And some people have a strong belief that drug-induced biochemical hyperglycemia or diabetes mellitus has the same implications as what one sees with obesity-generated hyperglycemia. And there are some publications of that nature. They're not particularly good. I don't think they're particularly well done. And I think that the groups that have looked at this most carefully, in my opinion, have not shown much, if any, risk from drug-induced or thiazide-induced hyperglycemia. We looked at it. We looked at hyperglycemia occurring during the first 2 years, and then what did that mean in terms of future risk? And in fact, I'll show you follow-up data later on, and we've now looked over about 10 years. And essentially, it didn't seem to mean much of anything. The only place where we saw an impact was in hyperglycemia occurring in the lisinopril group. But there, I'd say, you do enough statistical testing, and by chance, you're going to find a few that are positive. So I really wouldn't put any stock in this. So I'd say our experience is we didn't see much risk. SHEP has done an even longer follow-up, and their experience going over 18 years, they also have seen no impact. So I think the large studies that have looked at this, and I hope looked at it rigorously, have not demonstrated any risk associated with diuretic-induced hyperglycemia and, if you will, diabetes. But it's something that you can't be sure about. Well, having done the trial, we did what we do in many trials. We wanted to do some follow-up over a longer period of time to really assess whether the treatment differences noted during the trial itself were persistent over time, and whether any new differences developed after the discontinuation of randomized therapy. So the trial, as I mentioned, was done somewhere between 4 to 8 years of follow-up, on average 5 for each participant. Post-trial surveillance was about close to 5 years. So the total period of follow-up was between 8 to 13 years, or nearly 9 years overall. Our primary outcomes here were cardiovascular disease mortality, but we did assess all-cause, cause-specific mortality, and a lot of morbidity indicators as well. This was all done by passive surveillance, linking our data set to other national data sets. We did not directly contact the participants. We could not because of institutional regulation and informed consent. When we were starting this trial, we didn't ask the participants, may we contact you again later on? So our institutional review boards felt we couldn't do this. In fact, the VA said you cannot even link that data anonymously to national data sets, which I think is ridiculous, but that's their rules. So the VA participants were not included in the long-term experience. But we did use a lot of data sets and got a lot of useful information around cardiovascular outcomes, renal outcomes. We had no contact with the participants, so we had no ability to get post-trial information on blood pressure or use of medications, which is a great, it's a very unfortunate. I think I mentioned this, so I won't dwell on it. Well, when we looked in the long term, really didn't see much change over time. It looked like for the primary outcome, it's still persistent. Whatever drugs had been taken after the trial, we were not seeing any changes. We, in fact, didn't see that with all-cause mortality either. We did see a persistence of heart failure, but the gap seemed to be closing over time. And unfortunately, without knowing what drugs people are on, or without knowing their blood pressure, it's hard to interpret that. But at least what we saw is that for a pretty prolonged period of time, there was still quite a gap, particularly between the calcium channel blocker, the group that had been on calcium channel blockers, and the group that had been assigned to either of the other two agents. Well, there have been a number of other trials that have been purported to look at diuretics versus the newer agents. And ASCOT, or Anglo-Scandinavian Cardiac Outcome Trial, I think did a great job, double-blinded, looking at lipids and lipid treatment. And they did a very, very useful and helpful trial. I think on the other hand, hopefully not through any malicious intent, the blood pressure component of this trial was way overinterpreted. And it was purported to show that new agents are better than old agents. Well, in fact, there were differences. Unquestionably, there were differences, but the challenge with this trial was that it was really a calcium channel blocker versus beta blocker trial. Now, if you were designing a trial, I think you would be in a real minority if you thought that beta blockers without indication would be a good first step agent. I don't think anyone around the world is recommending that. And you'd have to ask yourself, why did the investigators pick that comparison? Because I could have told them that before they did the trial, guys, this is going to do better than this one. So that's really what it is. Only about half of those who were in either of these arms got the second agent. And in fact, they picked a diuretic and picked a dose that is an inconsequential dose. I don't think, again, anyone who was interested in the effect of diuretics would suggest that this dose is the right dose to use for a diuretic. And the third strike is it's an open label comparison. And you know, when you start doing open label comparisons of new agents versus old agents, you open up a huge problem. So I would say this is a really hard study to interpret, and I don't think in any way undermines a recommendation to use thiazide type agents as initial starting therapy. Now, a lot of that discussion of A versus B is a bit bogus anyway, because most patients require more than one drug, as any of us who treat hypertension know. In fact, in ALLHAT, only about a third, less than a third of our participants were effectively controlled on a single agent. In fact, only about a half were controlled on one or two agents. The majority of our participants required either 3 or 4 drugs to achieve goal blood pressure. And it was interesting in ALLHAT that we started at the time we started the trial, the norm in the community was controlling about 26% of hypertensives to 140 over 90 or below. Within 6 months, with a systematic approach and providing drug, we were up to above 70% control rates. And now in the US, because there's a lot of pressure and there's money in the game, we're not doing as well as we'd like to do, but the last national survey showed 50% control rates, and in the VA, the control rates are close to 80%. So we know that we can do a lot better once the systems are put in place. And ALLHAT is not unique. You know, when you look at almost any drug, they usually are more severe hypertensives, but almost any of these drugs of these trials are requiring 2 or 3 agents, on average about 3 agents to get effective blood pressure control. So for most people, it's not which one, but starting with a diuretic in the combination. And I think preferably starting with a long-acting agent at sufficient dose in the mix. We have continued to be active in ALLHAT and have moved. We have looked at a lot of other issues and have moved into some other areas. So in addition to the main results for the hypertension and lipid trials, we've put together a number of groups, and we've been publishing quite a bit on a really broad array of treatment and epidemiologic progress. We've published about 70 manuscripts to date, and we have about 40 in progress. We've got a lot of different working groups where we've invited specific people to join us. These are not the only areas, but areas where there's a lot of activity around diabetes, renal disease, heart failure, atrial fibrillation, stroke, race, ethnicity, and methods. And then we've participated actively in a number of meta-analysis projects. There is, as is required by the National Institutes of Health, a public version of the database available, but these are often quite hard to use. And you know, with these big databases, unless you're familiar with it and you know the little quirks, there are a lot of challenges. So we've gone into a third phase recently. We're about 6 months or 9 months into it, working with a lot of colleagues on an external advisory committee to try to help us. We've said we really want to open up this database to the scientific community at large, and the goal really was to optimize the scientific advancement from this study. The taxpayers put a lot of money into it. It's a good data set, and we really want to encourage people to take advantage of it. We'd like to think we've done a lot with it, but we're pretty sure that there are lots of things that we haven't thought about, and we don't have the time or the money to get around to it. The strengths of the database include its sample size, the completeness and thoroughness of the follow-up, the very detailed information that's available on phenotypes, the very careful blinded assessment of a lot of different outcomes. We have serology at baseline. What's available now is not great. It was not stored well. It can allow one to look at differences, but not at absolute values with any confidence. But we've got sera at the end of the trial from about 9,000 participants, and that's stored at -80, and it's in very good shape. Everyone's been genotyped, and we have an existing strong research team that people can collaborate with. So if you have any interest in this, I would encourage you, I won't go through all the details, but we have a lot of information on our website. It's www.allhatresearch.org, and it really lays out what we have, how to go through it, sort of commonly asked questions, problem solving, who to get in touch with, and so on. And we welcome the scientific community to try to take advantage of our data set. So I want to say obrigado, and it's a real pleasure to be here.